Hi there, my name is Jessica Howard, and I am thrilled to be hosting today's episode of Side Quest. A bit of a background on me, I am a games journalist and critic. But today I'm here because I get to talk to you about a really, really special game. Today I get to talk to you about not only my first favorite game, but the one that's firmly remained my favorite since I beat it when I was coincidentally 7 years old. And that game is Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII might be one of the first games I remember even playing. I was born in 1993. The game came out in 97. And what's funny is, so obviously I was 4 years old then, but my parents were really into gaming. They bought the game. And one of my earliest memories with like solid memory with any video game is sitting on my mom's lap when she did the chocobo races at the Golden Saucer, and she would put the chocobos on automatic. So they were just going by themselves based off like the stats that she had for the chocobos. But she would let me hold the controller. So I thought that I was racing them. And it sounds such like a weird little memory, but it's like one of my favorites with my mom. Just like her letting me do that. And because the Golden Saucer, for those of you who've played Final Fantasy VII, which I feel like is everybody. So, but the Golden Saucer is just like this really bright, colorful, like Las Vegas meets Chuck E. Cheese sort of place in the game. So as a kid, I just thought it was the coolest thing. And I was racing these giant birds. It was awesome. Moving on from that, the game itself is just incredible. It's absolutely the game that made me fall in love with gaming. I would not be on this podcast. I would not be doing games journalism. I would not be doing any of this, I think, if I hadn't played it. Because before that, I had seen games as being very synonymous with like gameplay and mechanics, like games were about jumping and collecting things and like that was what games were. And then enter Final Fantasy VII, and my perception completely shifted. It was the first game that I played where it was about the story. It was about the characters. It was about the emotional connection that you had with the game. It's absolutely the game that kind of set my trajectory in what I play, because if you look at all my other favorite games, the Mass Effect series, I know that's not technically one game, but the Mass Effect series and like Persona 4 Golden, they're all very much games that are great because their characters are. And Final Fantasy VII was the game that showed me that games could be like that. As I talk about the game, I will be fairly light with the spoilers. I won't straight up reveal the ending or anything like that, but I am going to be talking about the characters and their backstories and some of what they go through, just because the emotional connection I have with the game is reliant on me kind of divulging those things and talking about those characters. And something else that I do want to touch on before kind of getting into it, I guess, is the music and the art in Final Fantasy VII. Because I'm talking a lot about the plot and the characters, and for me, that is the most important part. But the music in that game is absolutely incredible. And it sounds really weird, me saying that the art is really good. Because for those of you who have seen Final Fantasy VII, and we're talking about the original here, not remake. This is the original. For those of you who have seen it, you know that all the characters they're just polygons. It's rough. You know that they are these really blocky looking characters. They just have little eyeballs on them. But the hand-drawn backgrounds in that game are gorgeous. The way that they compose the shots that make up the game, just like where they place the camera, and that sounds like a weird thing too. But if you're going to play through Final Fantasy VII again after listening to me here, pay attention to the camera angles and like how they show off different locations, because it's very intentional, I think. Even the use of color in that game, honestly, is very intentional, and I know that a lot of times that's the case. I won't pretend like Final Fantasy VII is the first game that ever did that, or you know what I mean, or it's some like revolutionary thing in that game. But it's cool. It's something to kind of notice, like the use of green in particular, being associated with Mako and the life stream and Earth is something to kind of take note of. It's also associated with Aerith. Like her eyes are naturally that color. It's not like some Mako infused thing. She naturally has those green eyes. It's no coincidence that the only locations in the slums that have greenery, that have that life, are Aerith's house and the church. It's just something that's kind of cool to notice, I guess. So if you go back and you play this game again, pay attention to the colors, pay attention to the camera angles. It's really interesting. But something I do want to go back to really quick, because I just touched on it before, is the music in the game. And this will be our segue into me talking about the plot and characters anyway. The music in this game, all done by Nobuo Uematsu, who does a bulk of the Final Fantasy series music, is so good. Like he's always good, but he went off with Final Fantasy VII. The opening track of the game is called Bombing Mission. The song opens up kind of somber. It's weird. It's like this somber, hopeful feel. And you see the live stream, and then you see a woman kneeling in prayer. And you later know this is Aerith, but at the beginning you're not sure who this is. The camera zooms out. You see the city of Midgar. The track builds as this happens. Then there's a cut to this train that's going incredibly fast, pulling up into a station, presumably. And you have the back and forth between the city, the train, and the music is just building. And then eventually it's this very high octane, like action music. It starts off from this kind of slow swell into this. And that's how our game starts. And it just sets the tone perfectly. And even after you have control of the character, the track is still going. Like I said, it's called Bombing Mission, and the game opens up with you doing a bombing mission, which, like, everybody is biased towards their favorite game, right? I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I don't love every single part of Final Fantasy VII. I can admit there are bad things about the game, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it is my favorite game, and I love it. But I like to imagine that even if some game came along and blew Final Fantasy VII out of the water for me, which feels blasphemous to even say, but if something came along and did that, I'd like to imagine that I would still stand by my belief that Final Fantasy VII has the greatest opening of all time, hands down. I'm a huge sucker for any piece of media that decides to start you off right in the middle of something. I just think that rather than have like kind of this grand exposition, to just drop you in and say, you know what, you'll catch on, is really cool. And Final Fantasy VII does this. You don't know what you're doing here. You don't know why there's this intense situation going on, but you pick it up and you realize you are a mercenary named Cloud Strife who is working with this eco-terrorism group called Avalanche to get back at Shinra. Shinra is the company that basically runs all of Midgar. And according to Avalanche, they are stealing life from the planet in order to power your homes. And that's such a strong stance to take right at the beginning of the game. For the most part, I'd be willing to guess that anyone who is listening to this lives in a society where capitalism and progress, these things are valued above all else. And in the world of Final Fantasy VII, we see this gone too far. And it's this whole game is kind of this warning against this. It goes other places too, but from the get-go, there's a lot that's politically charged about this game. And this game helped to kind of radicalize me because there's a lot here about the working class. There are themes of exploitation and what happens when corporations are involved with the government, the type of life that people lead. And you have this notion of, okay, well, it's all for the comfort of the people. It's all for the good of the people. And ultimately, your protagonists realize this isn't for the good of the people. We've just been convinced that it's for the good of the people because it lines the pockets of those who have the voice, of those who have control of the media. And they have control of law enforcement. Like, everything is under Shinra's control. It's this very corrupt society. And something that I really do love is I love the movie Akira, and you can tell there's a lot from Final Fantasy VII that comes from that movie. Even the genetic testing and experimentation by the government, I mean, that comes into play there. If you love either one of these things, Final Fantasy VII or Akira, watch or play the other one, because you will realize there is a lot there that is inspired by Akira. But this isn't about that, so I will move on. But the really cool thing is this is just one of the parts of Final Fantasy VII. This is not the whole focus. It's so multifaceted in its plot, in its characters. Everything has this fleshed out backstory. Everything has layers to it. So you spend the first 6-7 hours of the game where this is your primary focus, the city of Midgar, exploitation. It's still woven throughout the entire story, but this is your primary thing. You have this allusion to there being more. You have this relationship with Tifa. You have kind of this trauma that is there and kind of at the surface with Cloud Strife, your main character, but you don't really know what's going on. There's this man named Sephiroth who is involved somehow, and it all comes back to Shinra and the government. It really does, but it does go places outside of that. And like I said, it does this with the characters as well. You have your main party, but everybody around you has this story. And even your party members, they have things that go on outside of their role as your party member. Each one of them is introduced in a really cool way. One of my favorite characters in the entire game is Vincent Valentine, who is an optional character. You don't even have to get him. There's 2 characters in the game that you do not have to get, Yuffie and Vincent. But both of them have really cool backstories. And Vincent is actually very deeply intertwined in the backstory of the game and how Sephiroth came to be. And every character is kind of working through their own issues. And I can relate to all of them in these little ways. You have Cloud Strife, who, mild spoiler here, he's an unreliable narrator because of his own mental health issues. The game is basically told through 3 different perspectives. You have Cloud's original perspective. You have some of how Sephiroth sees it and how he's kind of misleading you to see it that way. And then you have the truth of it all, which doesn't really happen until Tifa, your childhood best friend, is there to support you and helps you kind of go over the events and how things actually happened. And it's weird. The game is kind of a mindfuck. But you have Cloud, who has these mental health issues, and I have mental health issues. I have BPD, so hard relate to everything that he goes through. You also have Tifa Lockhart, who has lost everything, has lost her family for a while, lost her childhood best friend / the guy she's in love with, Cloud Strife, your main character. And really what she wants and what she strives to do when you first meet her is she just wants to have that sense of family in her life. She is 100% the mom friend. That's kind of her role in Avalanche. She runs the bar where they hold their meetings. She's a caretaker. But the thing that I love about Tifa, as much as people will give her shit about, her outfit being very sexy and all of this, and her just being a very attractive character, she's also a very busty character. So she gets a lot of shit thrown her way for that. But at the same time, she is one of the first female characters where she is incredibly caring and very feminine and emotional. But at the same time, she is hard as nails. She is a brawler. I feel like so often female characters are associated. They have to be magic users. You know what I mean? Like they're not up in the shit. Like they're healers or magic users. And she uses her fists, you know, and it's really cool. She's a martial artist. And that's not where this combination of incredibly emotional characters who are also incredibly strong stops. You have Barrett Wallace, who is a very large black man with a gun for an arm. And you can absolutely say something here. There is the criticism that's valid that this is the weaponization of a black man. And it's something that needs to be acknowledged because Barrett is done dirty in a lot of ways. He is at his core, though, a really well-written character. He is emotional. He cares about the planet. He is a father to a young girl he adopted. And he's never afraid of showing his passion, of showing his emotion, and loving fiercely. He is a protector. You have Red 13, who is also dealing with the loss of family, which is something that a lot of the characters go through, honestly, is like kind of a loss of their identity or a loss of family, which is a very familiar feeling to a lot of us. We have Yuffie Kisaragi, who is a young girl who is kind of annoying. I feel like that's just, you know, something that a lot of people feel about her. She at one point steals all of your party members' materia and runs off, and you have to go to her hometown and retrieve it all, and it is a whole thing. So she's kind of a troublemaker, but at the same time, she's very much driven by this desire to protect her homeland, because she kind of represents a marginalized group in the world. There's Sid Highwind, who is an astronaut who is dealing with his own, it seems like, addiction problems and just kind of issues with aggression after having this huge perceived failure happen in his life. And he is kind of like, there's a lot that's problematic about him in his treatment of Shara in particular, who is kind of like his partner in a way. She obviously has affection towards him. It's a very strange relationship. She just wants to protect him and take care of him, and he is verbally abusive towards her. And it's something that in the remake I hope is done a little bit better, but he is overcoming these issues with, like I said, his own perceived failure and kind of the anguish that's brought him. Another character going through a really similar thing is Vincent Valentine, who I brought up a little bit earlier, but Vincent's whole thing is atonement and guilt and feeling like he is the reason why so much happened that could have been avoided if he would have taken action. And he also is a former Turk. And if you play the game, the Turks are a group within Shinra that does all of the really dirty work, the assassinations, like kidnapping, anything that Shinra needs done. These people are the ones who step up and do it. And the way that they kind of rationalize this, because they're really interesting. Like, they're very charming characters that do have like this moral code, kind of, but they also do this shit. And the way that they rationalize that is if they didn't do it, somebody else would. So it's better that they do it and do it in kind of this gentler way than maybe other people would do it. They're a whole thing. But Vincent Valentine was a part of this, and he feels, as many would, this regret. And to wrap this up, that's kind of the brilliance of Final Fantasy VII, and that's what first drew me to it. This is why it's my favorite game, is because it explores all of these universal emotions and these universal themes and these things that are prevalent in our own lives, these complications that we feel inside, or the complications that we have with our government and how society is run. It was the first game I ever played that was overt in its emotion and its political stances and talked about mental health in this very real way. If you haven't played the game or you've only played Remake, I do recommend going back and playing through this one. I know that it's aged. It's a very much a game from the PlayStation 1, but it's so worth it. And there are a lot of things in this game that don't translate quite perfectly into Remake. And Remake is still good. It's still a good game in its own right. but they are very much separate entities, and I feel like you get something different out of both of them. There's obviously overlap, but there's a difference there. So hey, if your backlog is empty, I do recommend going back and giving it a playthrough. And if it's not, throw it on up there for some time in the future. You won't be sorry that you did. This has been Jessica Howard gushing about Final Fantasy VII for 20 minutes, which when I first started filming this, I didn't think I would go past 10. But that just proves, and I feel like I only touched the surface, that just proves how much I adore this game. And I hope you enjoyed me talking about it. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is @JustJessIsFine. Over on Twitch, it's just @JessIsFine. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Side Quests, and as always, happy gaming.